Right, this is our 6th TOK video, and today we're going to look at sense perception. So, intro. Perception is the awareness of things through our 5 senses, and usually we have, and think about 5 senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. And if we had to stop and rank them, in most cases we're going to go with sight as our best sense, our most used sense. And smell is probably the least important. So a lot of what we're going to focus on is going to be sight because it's just used most often, more often, and when it comes to the big ideas and experiencing our world. Empiricism is the school of thought which claims that all knowledge must be based on perception. And so it's the idea, not necessarily that it's just the senses, but the senses come first. That everything you know had to originate somehow from the senses, not necessarily emotion or logic. Those other things can play a part, but it all starts with the senses. And that's the idea of empiricism, that everything starts first. All knowledge that you possess starts with the senses. How many senses there are, well, that's always up for debate. Some argue that humans have between 3 and maybe 30 senses. If we break it down to 3, this is where we're doing some combining. And so mechanical, as far as touch and hearing, chemical, taste and smell, and then light. And so this would break it down into 3 senses. But as we advance and as we analyze more, we start to think that there are more senses that don't quite connect perfectly to our normal 5 sense pattern, such as proprioception, the awareness of limbs in space. And that if you are completely in the dark, you can't see anything, you can still touch your nose without actually seeing where your nose is, where your hands are. This is the idea that how do you do that without using your other senses? This must be something different. Or equilibrioception, your sense of balance, in that you have this natural sense of balance that came from somewhere, but it's not connected to the other senses. Interoception, the awareness of stimuli inside the body, and that you're not using your other senses for that one. As well as thermoception, the awareness of temperature, and that this is kind of an offshoot of touch, but it's a little bit different. And so there's potential for a lot more than that. Those are just some examples. We could talk about experiencing acceleration, that you're able to feel acceleration. You are able to understand the passage of time. And these could be all other senses that they can add to the list. Synesthesia is when we do combos. And that this is a rare thing, but some people are able to experience 2 senses at once. And so this is the idea of seeing sounds, smelling sights, the idea that certain numbers have a color, certain letters have a color to them. And so you're doing combos. Some famous examples would be Vasily Kandinsky, who was a famous painter, and he does really interesting abstract work. Miles Davis, the musician, also had the condition. And some claim that we all have we're all a little bit synesthetes, in that we do metaphors in our speaking, the idea of smooth voice, loud church, sharp taste. In all 3 cases, we are doing combos of 2 different senses at once. Famous example is the Buba-Kiki test, in that you look at these 2 shapes. Which one of them would you say is Buba? Which one of them would you say is Kiki? Well, 9 times out of 10, most people say that the one that is round and smooth is Buba, and the one that is sharp is Kiki, because we associate these sounds to certain shapes. And so we already have these connections we may not even recognize. Other senses. Echolocation, and so some of these are beyond humans. And this is acoustic vision in which bats can see based on how their squeaks bounce off objects. So they're going to squeak, and then the sound goes off to hit something, it hits back, and they're able to interpret when the echo comes back how far a thing is. And so this is many animals besides bats as well. Magnetic sense, birds are sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field, giving them a strong sense of direction, so they always know which way is north, that humans may not. Heat detection, some snakes can detect prey in the dark using heat-sensitive organs, so there's no sound, there's no light, and that they're still able to precisely strike their targets. And then even humans, in some cases, have these extra alternative senses. Evelyn Glennie is a deaf percussionist who she performs barefoot because she can feel all the vibrations of her instruments around her. So she's able to, without actually hearing, she can feel the entire orchestra. She can feel everything around her. Daniel Kish was born blind, but he is able to use echolocation by clicking and listening for changes in the echo. So he's able to mountain bike by clicking and able to see the trail without actually using his eyes. Perceptual illusions, these are cases where we're able to mess with our heads a little bit, in that perception is made out of two parts. Sensation, this is the raw data provided by the world, what we see, what we hear, what we taste, this is raw data. So it's what's out there in the world. And then we have, what does our brain do with that data? How does our brain interpret it? And so that's where sometimes there's a disconnect between what is there versus what we see. And visual illusions kind of help to illustrate this point as far as how we see things may show that disconnect. And how many bars are there? 4 or 3? And let's look at 4 examples how visual illusions show our disconnect between what we see versus what is actually there. The sensation versus our interpretation. First is context. The idea of how we see something depends on where we see it. And if there's no context, these 2 dots, they're the same. If there's helpful context, then yeah, they still look the same. Or we can do misleading context, the idea that they are going to look a little bit different depending on where we put it. And so lots of visual illusions, you can put objects around it to change a little bit. Figure and ground, this is the tendency to focus on certain aspects of what we perceive as and treat the rest of the background. And so this would be something like, is this a young lady or an old woman? Depending on what you define as background versus foreground in the image, that's going to change the image. Right? So you have to look at that, and you're able to switch back and forth based on what you think is the most important part and the least important part. And that'll switch things around for you. Then we have the ideas of visual grouping, the tendency to group sensory data together and see them as shapes and patterns, and that this is just a collection of dots, but you also might see a Dalmatian. Even if it's just, and then we have this natural tendency that we want to see something out of what may be nothing. And so this idea of seeing things in those puffy clouds. And the expectations, this is data out of place can be easily ignored by our head. And so we have 3 signs right here that kind of show this problem. Paris in the spring, once in a lifetime, and the bird in the hand. But if you look closer and take the time, you realize that there are double words, Paris in the spring, once in a lifetime, bird in the hand. But our brain has blocked out the extra because it's not expected, and so we're just going to skip that, even though what is there is different than what is what you're perceiving. And then there's illusions with other senses, as far as the phantom phone vibration, in that you will feel it, but it doesn't exist. And that's probably the most common one that we're feeling more in the more modern era. Other major examples would be the McGurk effect, and we'll play with this in class. This is confusing between, let's say if I'm saying ba and da. Those are 2 different sounds. But with the McGurk effect, what people did was, somebody would say ba, 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 and then record of it. So the mouth is still making the ba sound, but let's do a recording where it's da. And because I'm saying one thing but you're hearing another, your brain will fill in what you see as the preferable one. So that's the McGurk effect as far as your brain is confused versus what it's hearing versus seeing. It wants to fill in and choose a side. Touch, if I have 2 objects that are the same size but different weights, equal weights, different size, you're going to think the larger object weighs more because it's bigger. And so what you see versus what you feel, there's a disconnect there. Then we have the soundbite effect, where people are given headphones and they're eating chips. And they record louder crisp sounds versus softer crisp sounds as people are eating. The people that were given the louder crisp sounds thought that the chips tasted better. The person with the softer crisp sounds thought the chips weren't as good. And so it's the disconnect between our taste and our hearing, that we can play with these ideas. The role of the unconscious. The brain is constantly making adjustments we don't even realize, and that there are things that we're constantly seeing, but the brain says that's not important, let's take that out. For example, you are always looking at your nose. Look at it now. You're always looking at it. You're constantly looking at it, but you rarely see it because you don't need to see it. So your brain just kind of wipes it out. Your brain says, all right, we don't need to look at the nose right now. It's not relevant. And so it just disappears. Your brain cancels it out. Or you wake up and look at the mirror in the morning. And the mirror shouldn't be right because the mirror is only half the size of your face. Your head should be twice as big, but because you're used to it, your brain says this is okay, this is normal. Not everyone's able to do this. In some cases, people suffer from visual agnosia. And this is a visual impairment in which a sufferer is able to see things but is unable to recognize or interpret them. So they can look at the data, they can receive the data, but the brain is not able to interpret. And so they can look at a fork and they will see, okay, there's a piece of metal with 3 prongs on it, but they won't be able to interpret that data. So this is visual agnosia. That some people have that disconnect between what you see and what is there. Some other examples as far as selectivity of perception. Certain sensory data is blocked out as unimportant, and we've talked about this. So some examples of when the brain will block things out. Interest, this is knowledge about a thing, causes someone to notice it more. As far as if somebody is really interested in snakes and they're walking along a trail, they're more likely to see more snakes. If they're really interested in red flowers, they're going to be able to pick up the red flowers in a very easy way. And so interest can cause certain things to pop out, cause them to notice it more. Emotions, if you're having a bad day, everything is seen in a negative light, or if you're having a good day, everything's seen as a positive light. What is there didn't change, but because your attitude changed, this can shift what is received, not what is there. And then cultural beliefs can also shape your perception. And so 2 examples as far as how culture can shape perception. One is vision, the cross-race effect. The tendency to recognize the individuals of one's own race more easily than those of other races. And there's a little joke meme for you. But it doesn't necessarily have to be your race, but it's whatever race that you are most comfortable with, that you're growing up around and you're kind of used to. So it's not necessarily biological, it's cultural. And that if you are a white guy is probably going to be able to recognize the other white guys, but maybe not for another race. So it's an issue of what you're used to, what you're not used to. Sound, and that we have certain difficulties with sounds or tones in new languages. So Japanese people may have difficulty with certain sounds. The L's and the R's are difficult. Versus people that speak English, they're not able to pick up tonal languages that are quite important, especially in China and Japan, that the idea of 2 words that sound the same to us, they're spelled the same, but because they have different tones, we don't understand. We can't pick up that tone. Change blindness, this, again, going along with all these ideas, this is the tendency not to notice retrospectively what used to be obvious. That you're looking at a crowd and everything looks normal, and then there's a gorilla in the background. You've seen this picture 20 times, you never noticed the gorilla because it's so out of place, it doesn't make sense, so your brain just said, we're going to ignore that. And so they focus on other things. You're not focused on what is different. Some examples as far as seeing and believing, this disconnect with people. Often people's desire to see something changes their perception of what they see, that they really want to see something, and so the brain says, okay, let's fill in the gap, even though it's not really there. In the case of science, throughout the 19th century, scientists believed that there was an extra planet between Mercury and the Sun called Vulcan. And they wanted to see it so bad and many scientists started to record data that they did see it. Even though later on we found, nope, there's no extra planet there. In the case of history, we have multiple perspectives of singular events. Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland in this case, where both sides claim that the other shot first. And people are seeing what they want to see. In the case of art, If we could look at pictures of ancient horses, and they have eyelashes on the top and the bottom, but if you look at an actual horse, they don't have lower eyelashes. And so it's this issue of what they want to see versus what is there. Eyewitness testimony can be pretty unreliable in that memory can be influenced and memory can change based on what you want to see. And so eyewitness testimony usually is not going to be able to hold up in court because our minds are not that reliable. The mind is not a camera. So how do we distinguish appearance, what we see versus what is actually there? Well, here's 3 things we can do. One is confirmation by another sense. You can see it, but that may not be enough, so maybe you need to touch it as well. You'll have to have backup with some other sense, that I see this thing. Is this a hologram? Nope, that's a person. Okay, so that is a person. I have used 2 senses to confirm it. Coherence, I'm going to use logic to fill in the gaps in your senses. That doesn't make sense. I'm not sure about that. Or maybe it would fill in, so you'd have to, where you can't, the senses fail you, you're going to have to figure out logically what's the correct pattern. And then independent testimony. This is confirming with other people saying, did you see that? And that I've looked at it, I've touched it, it's still not logical. I'm going to ask are you sure about that? And if you get all 3, then you can start to deal with the issues of doubt, of seeing versus believing. Ultimate reality, what is there? Well, again, our senses are limited. And when it comes to sight, we are limited when it comes to the light sensitivity, that there's so much more light out there. We're able to see this little tiny bit, 700 nanometers to 400 nanometers. But anything beyond that, we can't see. Even that doesn't mean it's not there. So infrared light, microwaves, radio waves are all around us. Ultraviolet light, X-rays, we are surrounded by light that we cannot see. And there's senses we lack, like echolocation, but there's a lot more sense data than what we can perceive. What's really out there? And that's the tricky thing on this, as far as, well, what is real when it comes to sense data? Pain. Can we quantify pain? Can I say that when I'm hurting, how can you really know that? How can I quantify on a scale of 1 to 10? But what does that mean to you? Taste, in that I might taste something that I like, but you may not like it. So what is it? As far as color, I can see one thing, but you may see another thing. So it's the question of which is acting here. Is it perception or interpretation? What's the more important sense as far as seeing the thing or interpreting the thing? What is the thing? What is green? Is green a physical thing, or is green an interpretation? I guess that's one little way to mess with your head. Another idea is the tree in the forest, the idea that if the tree falls in the woods and nobody's there to hear it, did it matter? Does it exist? And that does witness, does something need to be seen to exist? Does something need to be perceived to exist in reality? And then tables in the classroom, as far as objects' permanence. When you leave, do the tables still exist? Are they going to be there tomorrow? And because no one's witnessing it. And finally, to mess with your head a little bit more theories as far as sense data and what is real. Well, the easiest one is common sense realism. What you see is what you get. And so it's straightforward. I see this computer, therefore it's real. There's no need to get all philosophical about this. And then we get to scientific realism. The idea that we're going to use the scientific explanation. The view that the real world is not as the world appears to our senses, that there's so much more. And it needs to be described by science to an exact empirical formula. The idea that we are just atoms floating around, and nothing is real beyond the scientific equations that can fully explain it. And then we have phenomenalism, and this idea that to be is to be perceived. This is an extreme form of empiricism. We're talking about George Berkeley here, which claims that physical objects are just bundles of sense data that cannot be said to exist independently of our experience. As far as, I can be seen, I can be felt, I can be touched and heard, but that doesn't mean I'm real. That means that you can see an object in front of you. That doesn't mean it's real. And that all these senses can be data. So really, hey, all I am is just a bundle of sense data that you perceive, that doesn't mean I'm a real thing. And I know that's a tricky one. We're going to play with that more later.